Hey folks, welcome back to the podcast, Acid Horizon. Before we begin today's conversation, a couple of quick announcements from the Acid Horizon Research Commons. We've just added a new course to the AHRC archive. Adam Jones's Cause, Category, and Command, an introduction to Kant's first and second critiques. In this course, Adam offers a clear and rigorous introduction to Kant's critical philosophy, exploring themes of causality, the categories of understanding, and Kant's moral law. And a quick reminder, if you are hearing this episode when it drops on Sunday evening, there are only a few days left to enroll in Stuart Kendall's upcoming lecture and seminar series on George Bataille titled Formless. It begins on March 11th. You can find details about the course archive and the new classes in the show notes. Now, today we are turning to one of the most radical and unsettling thinkers of the 20th century, Günther Anders, featuring our local friend, Nicholas de Warren and Christopher Müller. Let's listen. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. We now inhabit a world seemingly overrun with human invention, machines and devices for every conceivable purpose. Yet we stand before the edifice of our own making with the uneasy sense that something has gone wrong. And what has gone wrong, perhaps, is us, we, the makers. Why have we, the creators of these machines, devolved into a condition of inadequacy, even shame, in the wake of their creation? Amid our ever-evolving technological landscape, where novel gadgets transmit information at accelerating speeds and we broadcast our personal brands in real time from the devices in our pockets, we ourselves seem to have been flung outward by a centrifugal force, dispersed into a series of mere functions and fragments. Joining us today are Christopher John Müller and returning local champion Penn State philosophy professor Nicholas de Warren to discuss the work of Günther Anders, a figure who has long orbited my intellectual horizon and whose writing I have been long overdue in engaging. Chris is the translator and co-editor of Günther Anders, The Obsolescence of the Human, a new release from the University of Minnesota Press, who actually graciously provided me with a copy of this substantial and handsome volume. And we must thank Nicholas as well, who has been speaking with me about Anders' work since we first met. As it happened, around the time I received the book from the publisher, Nicholas approached me about coordinating this episode with Chris, who is his friend and colleague. Needless to say, the gods have conspired, ironically, to push me towards Anders' notion of Promethean shame, a concept that I find utterly fascinating among many others in his work. So let's begin by first getting to know Chris and his work a bit more, and then I'm going to give Nicholas a very wide berth in this discussion, given his deep familiarity with Anders' writing. So Chris, welcome to the podcast, and could you tell us a little bit about you and your work?
Yeah, hi. Well, thanks. Thanks for an opportunity to be here and speak to this translation. So I'm a senior lecturer in cultural studies and media at Macquarie University, that's in Australia, in Sydney. And my work is really interested in the intersection of technology and emotion, all those strange feelings we have when we interact with technology, both the kind of joyous and the awkward and weird. And I came across the work of Günther Anders roughly 15 years ago. And since then, it's been a real fascination of mine. I've been doing a lot of translation of Anders' work. I found translating actually a really interesting way to think about the present day context and what machines do. And yeah, that's why I'm here, I guess.
Well, thank you, Chris. And Nicholas, of course, it's a real pleasure to have you back on the show. Your engagement with Anders seems to have been part of what made this conversation feel important and ultimately inevitable on this show. And in our initial meetings with each other, you often mention Anders' name, and I felt a bit alienated because I had not yet read his work. But here we are. And I would just like for you to say a few words to introduce yourself and your contact with this work.
Yes, thank you, Craig. And thank you again for organizing this opportunity to do a podcast and also to do a podcast with Chris Müller, whose work I've been following since he first put out a volume on Günther Anders with a partial translations. So my interest in Günther Anders also goes back maybe 15, 20 years when I had read The Obsolescence of the Human, so the Antiquität des Menschen in German. And I think much like anyone who discovers this text for the first time, and hopefully now more people will be able to discover it now that Chris has produced really an excellent translation, is that you really realize that this is a work from a thinker who, prophetic is the wrong word, but sort of is able to describe certain trajectories of how technology, and most specifically two primary forms of technology, mass media and its various formations. I mean, television was a thing he was thinking about, but then also something that we don't really think about anymore, which is nuclear weapons. How these two technologies, which emerge really out of the context of the 20th century and the Second World War, are fundamentally transforming the conditions of human existence. So it's a kind of anthropological event. And perhaps as importantly, as Anders himself recognized, it's a kind of challenge to the idea of a democracy and all of the values and structures that make a democracy possible. So it's in that context that early on I found Anders absolutely fascinating as a thinker, and therefore am more than happy to be here in part of this conversation today.
Thanks, Nicholas. Well, Chris, you as the translator and the co-editor of The Obsolescence of the Human, you've, of course, spent an extraordinary amount of time inside Anders' prose and his conceptual architecture. Maybe we can just begin with Anders, the man, the thinker, the life. From where does his writing and philosophy come? And as I understand it, he had a very sort of non-standard career in writing, if we would like to call it that.
Yeah, no. I mean, the question of Anders' life is, in a sense, really important for anyone who will read The Obsolescence. You will encounter Anders as a character in his own text, as a persona. So we kind of see the world from his perspective, from his life story. And his philosophy is really coming out of the experience of this life. And it's really quite an extraordinary life. So he's born in 1902 in Breslau, which is now the Polish city of Wrocław. He had a very eminent academic parents, Clara and William Stern. So he's born Günther Stern. They're eminent psychologists and philosophers, actually, in their own right. And then in the early 1920s, he does a PhD under Edmund Husserl. So very much a phenomenological project. He was also a student of Heidegger in Freiburg at the time, and kind of passed in this very eminent intellectual kind of cohort that a lot of very famous names today, Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, they're all kind of connected and related to him in all various ways. And I might just mention the really foundational school of thought that shapes a lot of Anders' work, which is philosophical anthropology. I think a term that has kind of been lost a bit. This is a school of thought that construed technology as a natural part of human existence. So rather than seeing technology as some alien other, we're beings who have naturally evolved to have like the power of artifice. We're born into a world that is artificial, and we have the ability to learn and adapt. Second nature becomes first nature, right? And that shapes his thinking very, very deeply. And then he's on track to a really eminent academic career. And with the Nazi rise to power, he's suddenly kind of ejected from the university. Like, advisors tell him to interrupt his study until the Nazi hype is over. He becomes a journalist in Berlin. And then very soon after Hitler's rise to power, he flees into exile. And in this time of exile, first in Paris, and then I think 16 years in the US, he's somehow reassessing and rewriting all his earlier philosophical work into this extraordinary book, right? And it's a book that is shaped by the precarity of exile, by the experience of like having your citizenship revoked and being an enemy alien in the US and kind of ejected from your home country, working in factories, in all these, like encountering technology really close up. So that would be kind of the bigger arch. I don't know, Nicholas, maybe you want to add, or maybe I've made a quick gloss here, but to me, that seems the unique kind of trajectory that the book documents.
Maybe I'll just add two little footnotes. One is, as Chris said, his parents were quite important and at the time quite advanced psychologists, experimental psychologists. And for those in the audience who are real specialists on Husserl, Husserl's lectures on time consciousness, the 1904-1905 lectures, begins with a discussion of an article by Günther Anders' father, William Steon, called Psychische Präsenzzeit, which delivers to Husserl sort of the key idea to open up what will then become the idea of inner time consciousness. So there's a kind of interesting influence or impact of his father. And his mother, Clara Steon, worked a lot with children and was one of the first to propose a kind of rudimentary IQ test for children. So he really comes from a very cultured and intellectual parents and background. Maybe one last little footnote. It's also not well known that two of Günther Anders' article from what Günther Anders called his negative anthropology, so kind of in this tradition of 1930s German anthropology. Two of these articles, and one in particular called The Pathology of Freedom, were translated into French before the Second World War, one of which was most likely also translated by Levinas. And so there's this kind of subterranean influence of Anders' thinking, especially the conception of shame and the idea of the non-fixity of the human, the nothingness of the human as freedom. Shame, obviously, important discussion in Levinas's early texts on evasion, de l'évasion, and then obviously starts being a nothingness. So there is a kind of subterranean Günther Anders stream of thinking that then runs through and then is picked up then in France. But indeed, to Chris's point, he's kind of an academically invisible ghost figure who sort of wanders through the world. And then part of that wandering is reflected in the very peculiar style of his writing and thinking.
Yeah, that's something that I'd actually like to pick up on a little bit more. The writing style of, for example, Promethean shame, which we'll talk about. I think we talked about it as a series of diary entries that then agglomerated into portions of an actual essay. It seems a little bit disjoint in that regard, but also I just find it utterly fascinating that Günther Anders, he's almost an avatar of para-academia in a way, functioning as a kind of subterranean academic on the outskirts of academia, but having had a PhD himself. Maybe we could just delve deeper into that.
I mean, yeah, the writing style reads to the very heart of Anders' thought. And I think what makes it, to me, very exciting to engage with this material, but not just the content, also the form. So I might just add that the Antiquität I just mentioned was a popular bestseller in Germany and remains so, right? It's a very well-selling book, I think almost 100,000 copies, which is extraordinary for a book of philosophy of that nature. And it reflects that Anders wrote for a public audience and his writing was meant to be read by a wider public. So that just is a caveat up front. And he develops a style of thinking he calls occasional philosophy. And we can think of this as a very situational, kind of situation-based work. So let's take Promethean shame, the word you've used a few times. So he defines this initially as the shame in view of the humiliatingly high quality of man-made things. So if you feel outclassed by a machine or if you feel kind of weirded out whilst using a technological device, you have experienced this kind of emotion he's talking about. And we're led into this through a diary entry in which he's encountering new objects and observing how his contemporaries react and respond to it. And he deduces from this theory that we feel inferior to machines, or that the well-functioning machine is making the body look kind of awkward, non-designed, like undesirable, unadaptable, all these kind of things that become big themes. And so the key here is that his starting point for philosophy is what he calls moments of embarrassment, moments where you're kind of thrown. And I think we're all very familiar with the kind of moments he isolates, so moments of rejection or feeling patronized by people or things, or by the way individuals hide behind institutions and machine processes. And these, rather than erasing them, become the starting point of knowledge. And his style really tries to amplify and blow them up. Diary entries, poems, philosophical writing, moral parables are all mixed to somehow give substance to something that is so easy to ignore and brush off and repress. So I think in that sense, it's got a very different starting point to knowledge, right? It addresses us as people who are already all too familiar with these feelings. So rather than kind of saying, oh, philosophy is about the things you don't know and I'm going to persuade you, it's kind of saying, no, it's about the things you know painfully well. And what do we do with it? So that might, and then it's just looking for this language. How can we talk about this power of technology and how people use technology to mistreat and abuse others? Maybe I'll add, he likens this method to caricature, to microscopy, and to telescopy. So to kind of this creation of this big blown up picture, this scene that you can somehow feel yourself into and identify with. And Anders, as a narrative voice, adopts all these different positions, which can make the text quite hard to pin down, even though it's very accessible. But you already said earlier, there's so many ideas, it's this fragmentary feel. I think that's a product of this style of thinking, of trying to find the deeper cause for this fleeting encounter.
And maybe I'll add to that as well, that among the other characterizations that Anders provides for his own writing, he also speaks of his writing style as exaggerated, sort of hyperbolic. And there, to Chris's point, it's the idea that no one can escape the way in which media and technology has impacted us in how we think, how we speak, and indeed sort of how we appear to each other. And so part of the writing style, through a kind of exaggeration, which also makes him sometimes difficult to assess philosophically, because sometimes we think his statements are a bit over the top, or they're a bit too robust. But part of that is to produce what in German you might call a Verfremdungseffekt. It's supposed to sort of alienate us or show us what we take for granted, that without, I just turn on the TV or I just turn on the internet and just start looking at the world, and that's how the world is delivered to me. And I think that nothing more happens than, I just see what's going on in the world, to show that this Selbstverständlichkeit, this taken for granted, is no longer to be taken for granted. And that requires a certain style that sort of uncodes how we are overcoded and overdetermined by various technologies, and in particular media technologies.
And I mean, it might help to give an example of this. Surrealism is a really strong influence, and surrealist imagery, and the text works very much with distortion, linguistic friction, and these kind of things. And I mean, one of my favorite kind of images is the one at the beginning of the second chapter, The World is Phantom and Matrix, where he presents people watching television as a new form of laborer, right? We're going to kind of, anyone who buys a television will have to completely change their social patterns. They'll no longer go out. They'll stay in at home. They'll no longer meet friends. They'll rearrange their living room, put the TV at the center. This will actually take a lot of work, a lot of effort, right? This doesn't happen by itself. But they do that to attain leisure and the feeling of ease. And in doing so, they will newly empower everyone who is on television, right? Because suddenly advertisers have a new audience, politicians can suddenly reach people in new ways. And he kind of says they work really hard to make themselves unfree in a new way, or to put themselves in the kind of orbit of a new form of power. And this kind of portrayal would be kind of typical. It paints us these very vivid images and depictions that we can kind of project ourselves into, but it does so through this kind of very strange linguistic style that is quite surreal, inverts common sense, and you're continuously asking yourself, hang on, what is happening here? How does this work? And that's to me the kind of joy of the material, and made it fun to translate as well.
I was curious how we could situate Günther Anders politically, given the sort of cohort that he rolled with, and being a student at Freiburg, and then also writing in the post-war era, maybe during the post-war consolidation of Eastern Europe by the Soviets, for example. If I'm not mistaken, one of these essays was written in 1956, around the time of the Hungarian Revolution being crushed by the Soviets. Clearly, he has a very strong anti-capitalist bent to him, but there is this sort of, could we say anyway, that he is anti-Promethean in the Marxist sense, or is his acknowledgement of Promethean shame just a criticism of a sort of vulnerability in the human constitution or the soul of humanity in a way that just reveals a kind of paradox about our Promethean vision for creating ourselves, for creating our reality?
for me, the thought really comes out of the experience of exile and worldlessness, which is a word Anders deploys throughout his thinking. So maybe it helps to think how that evolves. So in his early anthropological work, the Pathology of Freedom, the essay Nicholas mentioned, worldlessness is kind of presented as this human condition. We're all born into the world and we have to become at home, we have to learn languages, and really we'll have to make ourselves at home in the world. So this is a very generalizable, apolitical perspective that he would later be critical of. But I think ironically and impressively for Anders, worldlessness happens to him in a very new way, right? He is literally expelled from his country, loses all access to the world. And his writings, he wrote a lot about the experience of exile, and these writings are not very well known. And he documents the humiliation of being spoken down to if you have an accent. The sudden change of status, right? In Germany, he was an eminent academic, had a whole lot of cultural capital, arrives in the US, and no one knows Goethe or Heidegger or anything, right? And he's suddenly a nobody. And I think that feeling of humiliation, that perspective feeds into technology. And I think I get the sense sometimes, and I think this connection is very overtly made, that, oh, this technology makes me feel a certain way. And I know this feeling from being an emigree. I'm being excluded. I'm being patronized. I'm not being given access. So I think a lot of Anders' work comes out of that experience. But then, of course, as you say, politically, there's a very strong, Marx is a key influence and is often evoked. There is definitely a certain kind of general left-wing feel, but he's quite insistent that the book itself is trying to document something that goes beyond politics, right? That he's kind of saying technology is no longer merely a political instrument. Politics now happens within a technological world condition. Whether you're in the East or the West, technology is going to be shaping the way politics unfolds. So it makes it really hard to classify or pin down, I think, because there's so many overlaps, but I think this kind of life trajectory really also sets it apart.
I think there's something important that Chris mentioned, this also transformation in Günther Anders' thinking from what Günther Anders called his negative anthropology. So the pathology of freedom, this idea that human beings encounter the world as something strange that needs to be made into a home. And so the experience of the world is a kind of worldlessness. And then one tries to build homes. And technology is this project of making the worldlessness into something like a home. And then his own experience of exile transforms this sense of worldlessness. I would add there that he ends up in Hollywood, and during the war, it's quite amazing. He writes about this as well, works as a kind of prop manager in a Hollywood film studio. And there, I think, starts to experience kind of another overlaid form of worldlessness, which is modern American consumer culture, Hollywood, the production of simulation, a term that he himself uses, and then obviously connected to media. So there's a kind of exiled and the experience of a new kind of worldlessness, always being the outsider. And then technology itself produces another form of worldlessness that he then experiences in Hollywood, along with all of these other emigres. Adorno is there. Thomas Mann is there. So you can imagine these Germans completely displaced, trying to reconstruct a culture. Anders is much more attuned to, back to maybe your point, Craig, that underneath the divides and conflicts between capitalism, Stalinism, and in the context of the 20s and 30s, or even today, there's technology and the transformation of the world through technology, not only media technology, but for Anders, as importantly, is nuclear bombs, nuclear weapons, and the capacity to destroy humankind. That, in a sense, is a leveler, because regardless of what political persuasion you're in, we're all going to be caught in this anthropological upheaval. You might say that, I would say that the obsolescence of the human has a kind of implicit subtitle, the obsolescence of the political.
Thank you for conveying the narrative of Anders, because I think it helps to better situate some of the ideas and concerns that came up for me when encountering this work for the first time. As I wrote to you, Chris, and as some others who are in my orbit kind of pointed out, that for some, there's kind of a conservative color to some of the criticisms. I can point to a specific example where he compares and contrasts the flattening of the world through his concept of cosification that we can get into, where, our encounters with broadcast media, for example, basically they make us feel more dispersed, more dissipated in the world, whereas in the past, with the family, for example, the table was the center of the home, whereas now the TV has replaced the family dining room table, for example, and the vortical motion has shifted. With the family, you had a kind of centripetal force where everything sort of gathered and focused inwardly. However, with broadcast media, radio, TV, and what have you, now we experience ourselves not as family members, but each as a kind of siloed in audience, and our attention is dispersed, even if we have these experiences together, and I often think about this these days, just sitting down on the couch to watch Netflix with my wife, and there we are, we're both watching, and we're sometimes interacting, but there is always that moment where you feel as if, well, I'm just in my little corner of the world right now. And you have a kind of tunnel vision as you consume this media in front of you. And so there was a part of me initially that felt as if there was a kind of quietly traditionalist strain in his thought, but he quickly fends off any sort of incoming criticism that he might be endorsing a traditionalist view. It seems like that in every essay, there's a series of prolepses where he tries to say, I'm not saying that all technology is bad. In fact, there is one instance, I think it's in the second essay that we read, The World is Phantom and Matrix, where he even muses on the possibility of, it could be the case that there is a kind of technology that would restore human cohesion, but he doesn't really advance a program or an idea of what that might look like. So that raises the question in view of his criticisms of technology and, some of the ideas that I pointed to with respect to the family and technology. What is the kind of world that Anders envisions? Does he have a sort of positive program, or is there an alternative, given the fact that technology seems to be an imminently growing reality? What is to be done for him?
Yeah, no, that's a really important, I think, observation and question. And it kind of might be helpful to just think, what is the book itself trying to do? Or what does it narrate itself as doing? And we get this kind of quite elaborate introduction, which feels a bit kind of cobbled together and clumsy, where he's trying to explain that he's going to be trying to portray people who are trying to kind of catch up to their own technological reality, right? And he's kind of saying, somehow we're unable to imagine what technology is. He's writing right in the aftermath of the Second World War, bombed out cities, there's this massive destruction, and very quickly this new consumerist world has risen up. Everything seems to be kind of nice and normal again, but there's this underlying violence that he sees everywhere at work. And he's trying to say, well, I'm going to try to document these people. So, for instance, the family table scene is maybe an attempt to document or portray a certain type of behavior or person that he then becomes to associate with this new media technology. So we can basically maybe think of the book as trying to find a language to talk about the power of media and talk about technology, and to kind of say, we all know that the models of thought and the images of the human we've inherited from the 19th century, right, from kind of all the book cultures, Hegel, Kant, all these kind of people who live in a technologically, comparatively very primitive world, they don't seem to translate very easily into this present. Can I really speak of myself as a thinking and feeling I, if I know that my affect is coming directly from a video game? Yes, I am feeling and I am thinking, but clearly the technology is kind of shaping this experience to a very, very large extent, or maybe in a different way to, say, reading a book does, where the book might mold your emotional sense too through rhetoric, but the actual live experience and the immediacy of very mediated kind of realities is something new. And I think he's trying to kind of look for this language. And I think obsolescence becomes one of those paradigms where he says, oh, this old model somehow doesn't seem to fit. So I think sometimes it performs this conservatism as a means to help reveal what somehow doesn't fit. But I think he's clearly also speaking as someone who has been molded by that older world and now no longer fits into this new world. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't at times hold or represent these values, but these values become almost like a caricature. They're made a mockery of by this new world. So to me, when I was translating, I had to make all these, it was very hard to know to what extent is this ironic? Is this, how do you capture the tonality of the voice and the ambiguity? I mean, I really have to emphasize that the style of the German is such that multiple voices can be read into a text. You could read it in a very moralizing, with the doomsayer's voice. You could read it in the kind of Black Mirror satirical voice. There's a lot of different ways you can read this. So the kind of, I think, confusion you feel when you read his work is possibly something that he wants to document. We are all confused, and we should be confused, and we need a language to talk about this. But philosophy as it is doesn't seem to provide it, or provides us only by showing itself as lacking an appropriate image. So I don't know if that makes sense or rings true or rings familiar like this, but that's kind of the sense I have of this strange presence that Anders has in his text.
I think so. And I think the way you described it, these multiple voices, to the point where sometimes he also ventriloquizes other voices. Like there are moments in the book where he's like, I can imagine a heckler in the audience saying, this is too conservative, or what do you mean by this? So he sort of ventriloquizes someone who is skeptical or who would themselves try to expose what Anders is doing as maybe, well, too extreme or too exaggerated. But the multiple voices is also the images, or almost like the little vignettes, because the book is like different vignettes in different genres of writing. There'll be moments where it's much more recognizable as academic. There's a whole discussion about how the media, specifically television, has fundamentally transformed the nature of what an image is. And that's sort of the classical distinction inherited from Plato. There's an image that's an image of something real, or there's the image of something real. The distinction between what is real and what is not real or merely appears. Being in reality, appearance. Anders says all of these distinctions, to Chris's point, the way in which we understood these distinctions now no longer hold. So we have to sort of rethink our, if you wish, metaphysics, no longer with the stability of these seemingly forever stable distinctions, like being in appearance. So then there's moments where he'll say, oh, I read this newspaper story of a couple in London where, a happily married couple, and the woman is watching on the telly show, and she sort of becomes amorous or fascinated with a male character on a kind of soap opera show. And the husband then thinks that she's having an affair with him. And then the husband takes this real person who the woman obviously has never met, who is the actor, goes to court and says, I think you're having an affair. I want to get a divorce. And Anders says, the case is still undecided. So there's these moments where you have all these different voices. And that's also how the image of the family table, I think, also is layered with meanings. I mean, the way I read that, it's a kind of very clever way to talk about this idea that there is something in common called the world, as Hannah Arendt sort of argued. What brings us together in order to be different is a shared sense of a world, a sense of the common, or what Habermas would call the public sphere. That is what the metaphor, the family table is a kind of a metaphor for that, a space in which we appear to each other and we can speak to each other, whether in Arendt's sense as the political or in Habermasian, very ideal sense of the public sphere and communicative action. And I think what he's trying to say, Günther Anders, and it's funny that, what you mentioned, Craig, I mean, we all have that experience of sitting at home with our family and we're only talking to each other about the show. Or we gather together after dinner and we're on our iPhones, or someone's watching a show here, someone's watching a show there. I think this experience, it also struck me, I remember when I read Don DeLillo's White Noise, throughout the novel, you have these floating statements that come from television. The television said. So every time Don DeLillo is describing the American household, the family is having a conversation, but part of the conversation is the voice of TV or advertisement. And so that's a nice, I think, illustration of how the oversaturation of voices and codes, and there is no intimacy anymore of whether us as a nation or as a people or as a family, where we get together and appear to each other without this mediation through technology. And of course, all the symbolic systems and coding that comes with this mediation through media.
First, I wanted to say, the example of the newspaper clipping is a great example of this situational thinking, right? Because one of the joys of translating is that I had the time to go and look if these clippings existed, and actually managed to find and identify some of these sources. So there really is this little clipping of this court case, and that's like a free line little reportage, but Anders blows it up into like a 15 page or even longer chapter about this whole scenario and kind of fleshes it out and builds it up. And it really brings home, I guess, the question of the political again. Like, what does Anders say is bad about this, right? Is he really saying TV is bad or something like that? And I think this is really helpful in the Promethean shame article when he talks about we're trying to live up to our machines, we're changing in the way we behave so we can make use of machines, and somehow machines make us look like malfunctioning humans, or the computer can do much more or think much faster than I am, so I'm suddenly a bad writer, or something like that. He says, these processes are, in a sense, demonstrating to us that we can continuously adapt ourselves to new technological worlds. We can embody these, and that there's no kind of natural shape of the human, right? We can be all these different things. And then he asks, I think, the really important question. He says, we must always ask, but for who are we changing? And to whose benefit? Who profits from this new world, right? And he's basically making this intervention where he's saying, I'm not some sort of metaphysical conservative who says, we should remain the way we are just because that's the way we are. When we change, we should ask ourselves, is the world we're creating a world in which humans can live? Is it a livable world? And that's where the nuclear weapon becomes such an important symbol, right? Because he says, this is literally a technology that harbors a world without humans. So in a very concrete way, that technology can create a world that humans can't live in. And I think there's an analogy there to this consumer world of television where he's asking, is this really a world we can live in? Can we live with these pressures of having to live up, having to compete with some sort of TV idol, some sort of perfect human on screen? How does that make me feel if I don't have the looks? If I don't, and I think that little story of the housewife who falls in love with this actor and is somehow representative of a pressure you're probably on some level familiar with, but that's what I tried to say earlier. I think we just shrug this off. We just take it for granted as part. This is what it means to live in the world, and it's kind of childish to think about it because it's embarrassing. And this really, I think, tries to lead us into those embarrassing situations, or this thing to say, hey, there's something to talk about and think about here.
On the point of embarrassment, I have to say, it's been a while since I read a philosopher and I felt an immediate motivation to change my life. And it absolutely happened by reading Anders. And once again, I'm going to sound like what they call a wife guy here, in the sense that when I got home after reading part of The World is Phantom and Matrix, I thought, he's absolutely right about this dispersal of attention. That night, I pulled out a large coffee table art book with my wife. I'm like, we're putting the phones down, we're touching the book, we're looking at the pictures, and we're going to love it in just a total moment of performative attention together. So I have to give a thumbs up to Anders just for that, because it gave me at least one night of enriched humanity. But Nicholas, you had something else.
Well, just to add to what Chris was saying about the way in which we experience this shame before machines, but sort of repress it. Because part of the shame thesis is also kind of a repression of that. Because Anders has a really fascinating discussion about, can you really feel shame in front of a machine? given that most theories of shame, like in Sartre and others, is you feel shame in front of someone else. Someone else has eyes. And so Anders speaks about how the world has eyes, the machine has eyes. And here it makes me think of an ad. I don't know, well, Chris, you probably won't have this ad in Australia, but here in the US, Craig, there's this Grammarly ad where you see like one college kid has made their paper, they're all happy, and another kid, it's on two screens, is like sinking underwater because they're not able to get their paper done. So they obviously feel shame that they're inadequate to finish their paper. And then the punchline, if you wish, of the ad is, the other successful kid says, oh, you just need Grammarly. Grammarly is going to help you write your paper and, in a sense, overcome your shame at having not been able to write and write for you. And I think that's another good contemporary example of how we just think, oh, this is what we do. We have AI, we have Grammarly. And now if I want to know what Günther Anders says, I just ask Claude or ChatGPT, and it will tell me. And in a sense, I don't have the experience of the frustration, showing my own inadequacy of understanding and having to deal with it. In a sense, I have become obsolete because rather than me reading and understanding, something else, someone else, a machine has read for me. And then I can walk around without shame because I can say, oh, I know Günther Anders, even though in a sense, it has been delivered to me in a way that also makes me a bit cozy. I feel at home in the world because I now have this knowledge. Maybe on that note, I'd be curious to ask Chris because I know Chris has written a lot about trying to think of Günther Anders, how he thinks the framework, and trying to use that as a productive way to think about the digital age, which of course Günther Anders did not experience. Günther Anders died in the 80s, if I remember correctly. And I know that Chris has written a lot about Günther Anders in the digital age, how to think about the framework that Anders uses to look at media. Specifically, he's looking at television. Is that at all transferable? What can we learn to think about the complexity of a landscape, which is quite different because, of course, television is very different than all the forms of media. And then maybe also in terms of the Anthropocene, because I know that's also something that Chris has written some very interesting pieces on. So I'd be curious, Chris, if you can sort of talk to us a bit how you see Günther Anders in the digital age, as well as Günther Anders in the Anthropocene.
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I think the scene you picked out with the Grammarly ad, it's funny. I know the ad and I've been thinking about it. And so I think that's maybe a perfect way to think about how Anders translates into the digital age. So I said, like, the writing style of Anders brings us very close to the heart of his thought. And we might think of something like writing or the transparency of language as a very good access point to what Anders thinks. So when I previously tried to translate Anders into the digital age, there's always this temptation to just replace the technology because instead of TV, let's just put AI or something like that. And that seems to work on some level, but it also misses some nuances and aspects. So I started to think, well, how do we, like this situation that you're describing, Grammarly, what is the social situation, right? The social situation is we're in school. School is annoying. We've got a teacher who we're afraid of and they're patronizing us and they might be really cruel and I might lose face and they're not cool and I will be infected by that uncoolness and all these kind of things. And if we think of the kind of traditional setting, French thought, Louis Althusser has like this idea that, you go to school to learn how to speak proper French and to write proper English, or like translating it in that sense. And so you're creating, like you learned in school to render language transparent, right? You learn the proper way to speak, the world functions like that, and it will all feel very normal. But I guess the Grammarly ad exemplifies that this is actually a very hard thing to achieve. A lot of students won't learn proper French and will kind of resist that power by default because they can't pay attention and it's too hard. Because in that sense, no one can own language, right? Language is this thing embodied by every speaker. But now when we have like something like this Grammarly ad, in a very literal sense, Grammarly owns language or is able to embody language in a very different way to the speaker, because the moment we're outsourcing that struggle of finding the right words or of kind of trying to understand what we're asked to do when we're asked to speak, the moment we outsource all that effort onto a machine, we might never have to learn that struggle, right? And Anders, the Well Phantom and Matrix chapter talks of radio as robbing our language from us, right? Because it gives you these ready-made patterns of speech, and you can impersonate these patterns of speech and repeat them, and everyone will know them. But is this really your speech, right? This is maybe where this conservatism that you were mentioning comes in, where there's this kind of nostalgic idea that somehow every person needs to develop their voice, their style, their kind of thinking, right? But I guess if we approach it from the perspective that I find helpful, what Anders is saying is everyone is struggling with this medium, and this is hard, and it's difficult, and it can be embarrassing. And this is what makes it so attractive, to kind of not have that effort and have the ready-made solution ready-made for us. So a lot of what I'm interested in when thinking about the digital world today is this idea of frictionlessness that seems to be a mantra. And there's a lot of people who write about this very amazingly. Like there's a whole paradigm of media theory that is kind of saying, well, people these days calibrate friction or have this really flattering chatbot because really what they want to do is get you dependent and hooked on this technology, because that's very concrete power in the world, right? If hundreds of millions of people use your technology, you're running the world because you're running the technology. And so I think it kind of, Anders' metaphor really opens up a way of thinking about technology that I find exciting, because it comes not so much out of the infrastructural perspective, even though that is really important, but it kind of starts with, how does it feel to use technology? What are you doing when you're using technology? Why are you using technology? The paradigm is very anthropological uses, so addiction, hunger, need, all these bodily functions that somehow get re-experienced or transformed by the interaction with technology. It's exciting, it's joyous, but this excitement might be a form of disempowerment that you're not recognizing, these kind of things. So in terms of my own work, that's kind of what I've been using on this for, trying to just think through digital technology from that perspective, from the perspective of affect and emotion. What does it mean to be able to code emotion and use that to influence people? Or how does humor travel online, and what forms of humor, and these kind of things. And I guess when it comes to the Anthropocene, usually, just to go there, the chapter we haven't really touched upon, which I think is just a very big chapter, is this chapter on the bomb and our existence in the shadow of it, where he's trying to create this map of a world that exists as a world that is not yet destroyed, right? Very pragmatically, the world can be destroyed, but not yet. What does this mean for us? And there, the interesting thing is that the Anthropocene is usually kind of conceptualized as the presence of the human in the record, right? In the sense that we can have nuclear tests and the radioactive fallout is now a strata in the earth, and we'll date it that way. But Anders sees this technology in a very different way. And I think he's actually responding to Harry Truman's speech, the radio announcement of Hiroshima, where Harry Truman says something like, hundreds of thousands of people were involved in making the nuclear weapon, but no one knew what they were doing, right? Because of the secrecy and the power and the effect is so vast, right? And Anders is basically saying, well, this is the removal of the human, right? We have hundreds of thousands of people who are collaborating towards creating this very destructive and powerful device without experiencing their own contribution in any kind of moral way, right? They're not feeling, when they see the explosion on television, it's not something they co-produced. So it's, in a sense, for him, the removal of the human. So if we think the Anthropocene through Anders, then I think we can be kind of rationalized as, no, this is actually the age of the removal of the human, in which we're ever more alienated from our acts and ever more out of sync with our way of inhabiting the world. So these were just the kind of patterns of thought. And I really hope with the translation being available that people will find, I guess, the text is interesting and exciting and useful to work with, because I think it's really hard to say what an Andersarian take on the present would be. I think it just gives you so many different ways in, or so many different kind of registers and maybe a vocabulary that can connect to a lot of other contemporary thinkers. So that was really my motivation in taking on this project. I just personally found it so useful that I felt, well, I hope other people will find this useful too, because it felt absurd to be working with material that is not accessible in English.
I'll just make a little mention that Günther Anders entered into a letter correspondence with the American pilot Claude Etherly, and he was the pilot of the scout plane that scouted the target for Enola Gay, so the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And to Chris's point, he took upon himself to start this correspondence with this American pilot because he had heard that Claude Etherly was feeling a lot of guilt and remorse, like there was a kind of complex set of emotions that he was experiencing for having been one of the thousands of individuals who made this event possible. And so it's in that context that then they have a very interesting letter exchange with about this event. And I would also add to what Chris was saying that I would also say that, yes, the Anders' unique point about the Anthropocene is so much of the attention about the Anthropocene when, that concept was first introduced through these sort of golden spike markers of radioactivity in the geological strata. It sort of forgot that it's about the bomb. It's about the nuclear bomb coming out of a context of a war, and that this nuclear bomb is really the focal point for an Anders conception of the Anthropocene. Of course, the concept is not present to him, and not so much the radioactivity, but we already exist in a world that in a sense is without us, even though it is not yet without us because it is not yet destroyed. And there, another anecdote or story that he gives in The Obsolescence of the Human to make this connection between it's the war and nuclear weapons that is sort of the apotheosis of our obsolescence, is he recounts the story in 1951 when General MacArthur had decided to use nuclear weapons in Korea. So the Americans were really on the back foot. The North Koreans had invaded, had pushed the United Nations forces really almost off the edge of the southernmost tip of South Korea. General MacArthur, who is the great war hero, I will return of the Philippines, of the Pacific War, then had this idea that he's going to use nuclear weapons, sort of tactical nuclear weapons, to stabilize the military situation. And so then his decision, the sort of various generals and chief of command asked a computer, a UNIVAC, a primitive computer, to run that simulation and sort of double check General MacArthur's decision. And the computer said, no, don't do it. And so Günther Anders says this is, on the one hand, a great victory for humankind because General MacArthur did not start a third world war that inevitably could have brought the extinction of the human. But at the same time, it's a victory for us, but it's also the beginning of our demise because now we have a cybernetic system, he calls it the electric brain, that has taken over decisions and that now has taken over responsibility. And indeed, then MacArthur was then dismissed from command because of this proposal by Harry Truman. So it's another example of how it's really the bomb that, almost like in the Stanley Kubrick film, that no one is responsible and no one is really in charge. And instead you have the kind of the theater of people being in charge, but it's the system, it's the doomsday machine that's really in charge, as in the Kubrick film, or it's a cybernetic system, the electric brain, as he calls it in the 50s with regard to this episode with MacArthur.
And the ultimate irony being that MacArthur, after his retirement from the military, was going to work for the company that actually made the computer.
Exactly. The UNIVAC computer. He becomes head of that. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and I think that's such a wonderful anecdote. I would just come in because I think it links directly back to your Grammarly example. Because in a sense, that example, I think Anders kind of uses it to show, well, with this electric brain, the human has to be cast as untrustworthy, right? It's like we can no longer trust humans in a sense. And in a sense, that's exactly what the the Grammarly ad is trying to do is you can't trust your own. You need the confirmation or affirmation of the correct mode of writing. Only machines can truly write. And you need this correction, right? And I think, like, just going back to the politics of it all, there is always humans behind this as well that appear in on this, right? Someone is making that marketing campaign. Someone decides to run this decision through a computer and then tell the world, let's trust the computer and not the human, right? And I think the example really reveals something very important about, I think, the way power operates in a technological world, right? Or in a highly technologized world. So it's just like a great example of how I think something that is caricatured and possibly remote belonging to the 1950s actually translates in all sorts of ways right back into the present.
There's also another interesting sort of next sort of part to this MacArthur story in 1951. Daniel Borstein, the very established American historian who was also the librarian of the Library of Congress, he wrote a book in the early 60s called The Image on the pseudo event, which has a lot of similarities with what Anders understands as the phantom. And in the Daniel Borstein book, he talks about how, as an example of what he calls the pseudo event, so the simulated event that we take to be real and true because it's something that we see broadcast on television, the example he gives to introduce his notion of the pseudo event is after General MacArthur was dismissed from command, he went on a kind of tour through the U.S. celebrating his triumph. And when one of the parades in Chicago, basically nobody showed up. One of the attendees said it was really boring, and it was more interesting to watch on television because the televised broadcast of this triumph parade in Chicago made it seem as if there was tens of thousands of people who are actually there and quite jubilant. And Borstein says, this is the pseudo event, right? This is the simulacrum of the event that has replaced the real, because the only thing that is real is what now is televised, which we take to be the event. So it's interesting that Anders doesn't reference to that, and Daniel Borstein doesn't reference to the way in which MacArthur figures in Anders. But in a sense, both of those two converge: atomic bomb, cybernetics, obsolescence of the human, and the image and mass media.
You know, I'm really taken by just the absolute breadth of Anders' conceptual framework and how useful it is, and just how prescient it was just working with the mediums of TV and radio, and how just about any paragraph, any diary entry that we see in there can almost be instantly applied to today's contemporary conjecture and media milieu, whether it's social media, handheld devices, LLMs, even thinking about the concept of Promethean shame. These days online, there's a mass reaction of sorts to any posting of an AI video or anything that is even slightly colored with a sort of AI glow or has an AI aura to it, where people will just immediately call it slop and not worthy of attention and what have you. And we're recording this episode just maybe a week or 2 weeks after the release of Seedance 2.0, which is the LLM platform that creates like the cinematic videos. And I think it would just be completely dishonest if I were to look at that and say that's absolutely slop. I think it's frightening how quickly we have gone from the early days of the AI images like DALL-E 2, which was maybe only 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, producing these almost Picasso-esque sort of scrambles of color and mismatched fragments of body parts, to what we see now. And it makes me think that perhaps part of the expression of Promethean shame and its metamorphosis is this kind of mass outrage, this reaction that we're seeing to it as being a kind of dominant criticism. Now, of course, there are absolutely important ways that we must criticize artificial intelligence because its emergence out of the military-industrial complex. It's an ecological disaster to even keep the servers running. But I just think it's interesting that itself, in the public sense, has become the focus, is the outrage. To me, I think Anders is eminently useful here because I think that outrage speaks to the shame of this creation that we, at some point, will not be able to measure up, that there will be a point at which we will be tricked by an AI video and we will be rendered obsolete in our ability to make something on our own that could potentially match the quality or the seeming accuracy of any given image.
No, I think that's a wonderful observation. And I think the prescience really comes from the way of thinking about technology, right? So for us, from the outset, we are living through our media. We are living through technology, whether it be language, whether it be television and stuff like that. New media bring new conditions. And I think the rapid evolution of AI images and this idea of slop, I think, or the dismissal of slop is also like, do I really want to live through this medium? Or can I project myself into this world? Is there a place for me? And I think if you don't see a place for yourself, whether it be out of taste or skill or whatever, then immediately it's going to be a very vulnerable or frightening experience. But at the same time, there's a counterposition, and that goes back to this notion of power. AI is also being brought into the world in a way that frames the human as in need of being better and more efficient. Right? There's no need for these technologies to be rolled out in that way or to be as anthropomorphic or as being kind of used to highlight efficiency gains or something like that, right? Those are kind of decisions that engineers and marketing and institutions implement and take. And again, I think there's a vulnerability there for us as kind of just users of this technology or in the world, right? Because it can be very hard to say, no, but in this framing of this technology, there's very little space for us. For instance, I mean, my own university is calling AI collaborators, right? Is this a good framing? Is this image of collaboration one that I can embody as a, say, educator, or is there maybe different ways to frame? And it can be very frustrating trying to see these framings and then think, oh my God, how am I going to live in this world? So I think that stubbornness is something that almost reveals. It's like we're resistant to change precisely because we're changeable. It's a lot of work to change.
Can I say I absolutely love that take on it? Because in a social media context or anywhere else, we see people just doubling down on the outrage, which is just ultimately a compounding of a sort of ressentiment towards the machines. Whereas what you're flagging up here is the notion that we are vulnerable, we're dislocated, and that there is a shared confusion about where we could be in the world, where we need to be in the world, and locating others who share that confusion as part of a broader ethical project to identify who and what we are in the present conjecture.
Yeah, and there I would say, I mean, going back to a theme we discussed already, I mean, on the one hand, Anders doesn't give a moral critique of technology. So there's no moralizing. So it's difficult to say it's bad in a moral sense. One could interpret that what he's saying is this is how technology thus far, these new technologies have been shaping us. But it doesn't prevent the possibility that there would be other ways in which we then readapt the technologies to our needs and our desires and our emotions. And this is part of this idea, going back to one of his notions in his anthropology, so so-called negative anthropology, that, you know, humans are defined by lacking something, by something which is not fixed. And then that's the impulse to make things. We make things in order to give ourselves a kind of fixity and a place in the world. But for Anders in his earlier negative anthropology, and I think this still is held over in his later thinking, there's always the possibility of escaping what we have become in terms of what we have made. And increasingly, we might say that more and more that horizon of becoming other than what we have made by unmaking ourselves through the things we have made, that's the real danger. So it leaves open the possibility that there could be ways in which AI or whatever technology is something that could promote a kind of flourishing, if you wish, or a kind of a sense of the human being in the world. That's not ruled out categorically by Günther Anders on my read, but he is worried that increasingly this otherwise than being, as being mediated as currently configured by the machines we have made, that window is sort of closing rapidly. And today one might say it's perhaps closing even more rapidly. So that's a sense in which, yes, he's not against technology per se.
Actually, that's a really helpful frame of reference to bring in, because there's one I guess, contradiction or tension that runs through Anders' text, which is the use of the word the human, right, in the singular, which can be difficult, right, to understand what is meant by this. And in the early anthropology, pathology of freedom, he says, like, humans are human in a very specific way, right? It's only the variable of the general that counts, right? So you can be human in many different ways. He says, like, look at history, look at culture, look at languages. There's so many different ways humans are human. So there's this inherent multiplicity to the, right, human. And then he says, ironically, the rise of technology creates the singular, because something like the nuclear weapon is this ultimate leveler, right? We're all going to be equally affected to the bomb. Everybody is just biological matter that can be radiated. So this kind of multiplicity is under threat precisely because technology, through its kind of formative power and its own kind of reality, has this capacity to create worlds in which human existence is very narrowly defined or in a very narrow way. And I think, so, like, whenever I hear like these AI visions of the future or speculations about technology, it's always interesting to think, how do these visions accommodate any form of multiplicity? Do they accept it? Do they open up the possibility of multiple different ways of inhabiting a space? Or are they very, very kind of monolithically defined in certain ways? And I think there is a certain tension there where language such as efficiency, cognitive capacity, and all these kind of things creates these unifying measures by which every human can be compared, even though to others, humans are incomparable, right? By definition, you can only compare them insofar as we're different from each other, right? That's what we have in common. We're different. And in the early essays, which is also, I think, why they might have influenced French thought and Sartre, we're haunted by that, right? We're precisely who we are, but we can imagine being different because we have evidence of that in every other human we meet. This is deeply unsettling. This can be like, oh my God, I wish I was different. To him, this is like one of the fundamental experiences of being in the world. And I think technology becomes this avenue by which we try to kind of come to terms with this and express ourselves, find meaning, form a home, a place. So I think there is certainly not an inherent critique of technology, but I think there's definitely a very inherent critique of the way technology is currently coming into the world and to what it's doing to the world in a material sense of destroying it ecologically, but also in creating realities that for many humans are very unlivable. And that for me kind of really sets his thinking in a nice kind of dialogue with a lot of contemporary and, thought on technology, where it kind of fills out a lot of those kind of gaps by bringing it back into the lived context or lived experience.
So, Chris and Nicholas, as we head towards wrapping up, I have a specific question for each one of you. Now that we have the obsolescence of the human, the Anglophone world can enjoy Günther Anders' work. Is there a project to bring any more of his work into translation?
I hope. I've translated a few texts in the past, and there's a lot of people who are translating Anders currently in short essays. I know of a few. Hopefully, his diaries, his New York diaries, will hopefully be translated. They're really, really fun. There's a few projects I'm aware of, so I'm not quite sure if I have to check in if people want them in the public domain. But I really do hope that people take this as an opportunity to translate Anders' work. He wrote about 30 books and hundreds of shorter essays. So there's a wealth of material. It's not easy to translate. It takes a lot of time. It's a tricky style, but it's a very rewarding experience on all sorts of levels. In terms of, I think there's just so much out there in Anders' work that would speak to the present, not just the obsolescence of the human, also his diaries. There's a really great book, Der Blick vom Mond, The View from the Moon, about space travel, which seems to speak very, very powerfully to some of our tech oligarchs who like building rockets. So that might be an interesting text. I don't know, Nicholas, do you know of anything?
Well, I already mentioned this once to Chris to encourage him, but I understand he's already put a lot of labor in this translation, but it's the obsolescence of the human. So in German, the Antiquität mentioned is actually in 2 volumes. And the volume one, which is what Chris has translated, which has now appeared in Minnesota, is the first volume. In German, there's a second volume, which is differently organized. It contains very sort of short chapters, short essays on really a range of topics, some of them revisiting topics that Anders had developed in the first volume. Some of them, as Chris mentioned, he really had this curiosity that was boundless about, traveling to the moon. He has a wonderful essay about the human as the animal that throws things. He calls it the animal jacens. So the richness of his thinking is in the second volume also on display. To my knowledge, no one's translating that, and Chris had mentioned to me at some point earlier that that wasn't part of the plan with Minnesota, is to translate both volumes, but only the first volume. But of course, that would be eminently desirable to have someone translate the second volume of The Obsolescence, and maybe in terms of maybe not translation of text, but in a sense what we're doing here. I mean, Günther Anders is the kind of thinker that continually has to be translated into our present, because as Chris mentioned, he is a thinker of his present. This is what he means by Gelegenheitsphilosophie. He reads an article in a newspaper, he sees a TV show, he hears Truman give a speech. So he's always trying to think through the present, unlike Sartre, without totalizing it. So that's the multiplicity of voices. So it means that Günther Anders is a kind of voice that every present has to sort of translate into itself. And I think that's, one of the things that's quite commendable about Chris's effort. I think it took you many years, maybe 10 years, I think you mentioned, to translate this, because I had always thought someone needs to translate it. Of course, I was too ashamed. I'm not going to do it. But so I think this is really commendable, to translate the book into English, to have it translated. And like our conversation today, and also what Chris has been doing, is translating Günther Anders into our present, such that tomorrow's present can also then retranslate Günther Anders from our present into their present, in a sense, into a world without us, Craig, Chris, and myself.
Yes, and that's wonderful. Thanks, Nicholas. And I think I would really want to echo and second that, like really seeing Anders as someone, or the work is inviting this translational work and this exploration of what text and ideas can do and how they can be useful. So, yeah, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk this through and unpack some of this remarkable book. It took a long time, and anyone who will translate his work will hopefully find it as rewarding as I did. One of the difficulties is that Anders I think it needs to land, it needs to connect. And it can be hard to make that happen. It can be hard to find the right cadence, rhythm, that kind of stuff. So that's what took time. And I really want to just end by thanking the readers. I had a lot of readers who were reading drafts, often readers who didn't speak German. And I'd ask them, like, can you identify the humor, or what point did you stop reading, and that kind of thing. And that work really, really helped, and is really very much co-responsible for hopefully an engaging read. That was kind of the main priority, is to kind of convey some of the kind of encounter with this textual persona Anders that I was so fond of in the German, where it was really kind of different and fun to read and frustrating, irritating, and in all this kind of emotional breadth. And I think I really love it if people would start translating more. I would love to see more translations coming out. I'll continue to translate myself, I'm sure, in some capacity, but yeah, it's just also kind of making it very clear that I would very much welcome people stepping into this space.
And this discussion and this episode is now a clarion call to all graduate students out there who have about 10 years of spare time, while we are still not yet destroyed by nuclear weapons, to go ahead and translate Volume 2 and the many other fabulous works of Günther Anders. And Nicholas, you had talked to us about perhaps doing a course for the Acid Horizon Research Commons, where maybe you integrate some of this work on Anders and talk perhaps about science fiction. What were you thinking about?
Yes. So, I mean, when one reads Günther Anders, what one immediately sees the interesting sort of fruitful connections with other thinkers who are also thinkers of media, the Anthropocene. first comes to mind is Baudrillard. Anyone who's read Baudrillard and the evolution of Baudrillard's thinking sees a lot of interesting resonances and overlaps. And indeed, in Baudrillard's last text, The Agony of Power, he speaks specifically of Günther Anders and really picks up the Anders vocabulary. He says in the digital age, in the age of carnival and cannibalism, as he calls it, the obsolescence of the human is complete. I mentioned also Daniel Borstein, lesser known, but people who are interested in Guy Debord, Society Spectacle. So I was thinking it'd be really interesting to do sort of in the context that you mentioned, a kind of a course or a seminar on Günther Anders and us. So us being Guy Debord, Baudrillard, other media theorists that, as Chris mentioned, are also interested in these questions, but then also connecting it to science fiction, because I think you can really plot a lot of Günther Anders' thinking through science fiction novels, beginning with Fahrenheit 451, which also has this idea that the television has usurped the family living space through Don DeLillo, Philip K. Dick, etc., and this problem of transhumanism and the Anthropocene, and we have entered into the age of machines. So the idea was to think about Günther Anders as a kind of science fiction philosopher, in the sense that Baudrillard, our world is already a kind of science fiction world. So it's not a philosophy of science fiction, but it's a philosophy that thinks about a world that has become a kind of science fiction. And to do that by looking at science fiction novels, as well as then theorists and other more contemporary thinkers who are also interested in these questions. So that would be the basic pitch for this course that I would do then in this program that you're hosting through Acid Horizon.
And we are absolutely going to put that together. Chris and Nicholas, I want to thank you for an excellent conversation. You have done a fine service for the public by introducing Günther Anders to the English-speaking world.
And let me also thank Chris, because again, the translation is really excellent. I mean, I know it from reading German. It's a very difficult book. It's really an excellent translation, extremely readable. And it still captures that openness to a broad public that Chris mentioned was the intention of Günther Anders. And so to preserve that, I think, was really quite a feat. So I just want to recognize and applaud that, Chris, you as a translator, as well as an interpreter and thinker of these issues for today.
Thank you very much. No, and thanks for the opportunity to unpack, the book and these ideas. Very much enjoyed it.